So today I'm going to talk about more specifically how to build consumer trust and confidence through an accountability-based approach to data protection. Now, we may be hearing sometimes you might be hearing this term called accountability, right? So what does that mean? And I'm going to touch on a bit more about this particular principle, this concept, which by the way happened to be one of the obligations under the Personal Data Protection Act. Okay, so I'll cover that in a bit more detail. A bit more about myself. My name is Yong Chai. So I just share with you a bit more about my my background. In terms of experience and qualification, I am a certified information privacy manager issued by the IAPP, which is the International Association of Privacy Professionals, and I obtained my advanced certificate in learning and performance. That's the new version of ACTA. I graduated from NUS School of Computing. Okay, so I'm an alumni in NUS. So I'm actually IT trained. I'm not legally trained, but in terms of the work-wise, 35 years in the public service, and I was involved in e-gov consulting with other countries. I was IT manager in one of the ministries, and then I was also involved in organization culture development as well as data protection. Okay, so I'll share with you about my data protection experience after this. I was also a ex-deputy director at the Personal Data Protection Commission, PDPC. This is the regulatory agencies that regulates the PDPA. I left PDPC 2019 December to come out to do training. But when I was there for 7 years, I was very much involved in the whole competency development for data protection officers, and also spend quite a bit of time and effort in terms of helping organizations to comply with PDPA. So here we're talking about a lot of resources and tools and so on that is made available for companies to comply with the PDPA. And I also spent about 3-4 years helping my boss to run the DP office within PDPC, right? So that was my experience within PDPC 7 years. And I came out to do training and consulting for data protection, more with the intention of trying to upskill data protection professionals out in the industry, and in the process also help to build organization DP capabilities, right? Because I think you'll be hearing a lot of cases nowadays, data breaches and so on, and all of these are involving personal data. So it's important for organization to actually pay attention to that, which is why we talk about consumer trust and confidence. And because of my experience in PDPC previously, I am actually very much aware of the tools and resources and so on that are available, right, which I can share with the DPOs and DP professionals, right? So that's really a bit about myself. Right, for today's topic, I'll be covering these 4 areas. Okay, first is this concept of accountability. What does accountability means? What do you understand by the word accountability? And I will also highlight about the accountability obligation in the PDPA. Now, for some of you who may be aware, the PDPA has got now 10 obligations. All right, there's another 11th one that should be coming soon, but not regulated yet. 10 obligation in terms of data protection, and 1 do not call obligation. Right, so one of the 10 data protection obligation is the accountability obligation. So I'll just share a bit more about what is expected of organization as far as meeting up with the accountability obligation within the PDPA. And then I would quickly share with you some of the tools and resources that can help organizations to implement good data protection policies and practices, right? So what are they? And I will make reference to some of the tools that's available in the PDPC website. By the way, these are all the information in the website are all free. You can even download and make reference to it anytime, right? And of course, after this will be this question of what's next, right? After you hear about this and so on, what is it that you can do about it? Okay, so this will be the 4 topics that I'll be covering. Anytime if you have any questions and so on, you can actually just type it into the Q&A, and then we will be able to try and address it as much as possible. Okay. Let me just try and see whether I can. Let me just give me. I try to. Speak a bit louder. Okay. Okay, so when we talk about accountability, right? As far as the accountability in the context of data protection is about two things. One is about, as an organization, being responsible, okay, and with the data that you have. Because why? You are actually collecting personal data of your customers, you're collecting personal data of your employees, right? Now, and if you're actually taking care of the data, then you have to be responsible for the information and personal data that the individuals have entrusted upon to you. And the other thing is not just being responsible, but be able to demonstrate that you have actually put in place certain policies and processes to manage this data, right? So being responsible and to be able to demonstrate. We'll talk about it a bit later in the next slide. And when we talk about accountability, we are talking about accountability to individuals, right? Consumers, your customers, and even your employees, right? Employees' personal data are also something that you have to take care of. Of course, partners, okay, and of course, you're accountable to the regulators, right? Which is in this case, the PDPC, and also some of your sector regulators as well. Now, the concept of accountability in data protection here refers to an organization being responsible for personal data it has collected and obtained for processing. Right? So you're talking about responsible for this data, and besides having the capacity to comply, the accountable organization should be able to demonstrate proper management and protection. Right? So it's not just the responsibility, but also demonstrate that you have the proper tools and management processes and so on to protect the personal data that's under your organization's care, right? Now, along the way, you will see that I've made references to some of the documents which I'm able to actually refer it from the PDPC website. So for those of you who are interested, you can actually go and Google this, and you should be able to obtain a copy of this from the PDPC website. Okay. By the way, these are all downloadable, and they're all in PDF files. Okay. Right. Now, besides the PDPA in Singapore, there are also other organizations that are related to, that are dealing with data protection. And here I actually make reference to two of the organization here. One is the Center for Information Policy Leadership. Okay, they are very active in the area of data protection, and this is how they define accountability. Yeah, an accountable organization is one that can demonstrate that it has effective internal processes in place to comply with its legal and regulatory obligations. Right. So you think about it, you look at the definition is fairly similar. And a framework that operationalizes and translates principle-based law into effective internal policies, procedures, and controls. So what it means is that it is, when we talk about PDPA, it is the regulation. You have to understand the laws, the requirement, the regulatory requirements. But it is more than that, because you have to operationalize it. Right? Everything that you talk about in terms of the laws and so on has to be translated into policies, practices, procedures, right? So this is what it means by being able to demonstrate that you have got all the management processes in place. IAPP is the International Association for Privacy Professionals. This is one association where all the privacy or data protection professionals can become members of. And here, the way they define accountability is what? Accountability does not redefine policies, privacy, or replaces law, right? It doesn't do that. But it shifts the focus of the governance to the company or organization's ability to demonstrate its capacity to achieve certain privacy or data protection goals, right? So it's what must you do to be able to demonstrate that again. So the demonstration part and the responsibility part comes out very, very clearly in no matter where you look at the definition. So when we talk about accountability, same thing. Now in PDPA, Singapore's PDPA, you do get to hear about the accountability obligations, right, as part of the law. But if you were to look further beyond Singapore, you will realize that APEC, which is the Asia Pacific Economic will also have a privacy framework. Then they also talk about accountability. EU GDPR, okay, which is the EU General Data Protection Regulations, they also have the principle of accountability. So it's a principle that is actually quite pervasive if you look at different jurisdictions. Now, question will be, in fact, for a lot of organizations, it's really what is accountability versus what is compliance. Okay, now a lot of time when we look at laws and regulations, so it's about compliance, right? Everything this will be under the you have to comply with the law because if not, something will happen. You get fined, you get penalty, and so on. But when we talk about accountability, we need to make sure that the company shift their mindset from one where if you adopt a compliance-based approach, then basically what the company or organization does is to check box. Okay, the regulations say 5 things. Have I done this? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I check, 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 check. That's it, right? Nothing more, nothing less, right? So that is a very much compliant-based approach, and the mindset then becomes what? It's one whereby your focus is then trying to meet the law, trying to meet the regulation, right? The focus is then on the regulation. Whereas if you adopt an accountability-based approach, now the mindset shift then becomes one where the company now has to look at the customer to be the center already, because you have to be accountable to your customers, right? And whether or not the law says so, you have to then think about ways to make sure that you can demonstrate what you're doing, right? And you're responsible for the personal data that you have of them, right? So that calls for the mindset change from focusing on the regulation to focusing on the customer. Now I can tell you, if you adopt a accountability-based approach, which is customer-centric, then a lot of times when you do things, you will be doing it because you think it's necessary, right? Because you think that it's good for the customer, and because you think that it can help you build consumer trust and confidence, right? So that is actually going to be a very powerful mindset shift for companies who are going to adopt a data protection initiative. Okay, so very important to differentiate that and to move this mindset shift. And when we talk about proper management, okay, we are talking about what? We are talking about policies and practices. We are talking about having proper controls, right, to ensure that, in fact, whatever they define as policies, practices are indeed implemented. Okay, no point defining a very nice set of policies and practices, and then it becomes a document that sits in your drawer, right? It has to be implemented, right? And at the end of the day, when we talk about management of PD and so on, personal data, it is really about a culture, right? Building a culture whereby whenever a staff, an employee looks at personal data, right, they will be very much aware that, hey, this is something that I need to do. I need to do it properly. I need to protect this. And this in fact, I extracted this from one of the articles that was prepared by Mr. Yong Zekin, who is the Deputy Commissioner of PDPC, right? So it was actually published in the Singapore Institute of Directors publication, right? So that's what he meant about proper management of personal data. Okay. Now, if let's say a company were to adopt a accountability approach to personal data protection, then what you can see as benefits will be, first of all, it will then strengthen public trust in your company, right? Because the customers now can see that indeed you are doing something that is responsible use of personal data, and you're actually demonstrating that you can do it properly. Okay, you can enhance business competitiveness, because why? If I'm a customer, if I look at 2 companies and I realize that one of them is actually taking care of my data properly versus one that really don't bother and so on, I might decide to just go with this company and not the other company, right? So there will be this element of business competitiveness, and of course, by demonstrating that you have got all these policies and processes, it does provide confidence to your customers and even also to your consumers that this is a responsible organization. Now, and this is important because why? Because if you think about today's digital economy, right, we're talking about digital transformation and so on. Every company is now moving very fast towards this whole digital economy. Now, and invariably, you will be handling data, all right? And invariably, you'll be handling personal data, because that's where, in fact, you can actually harvest a lot of value from the personal data you have. Okay, now how do you do that? Okay, now if you don't do this properly, then chances is that the customer will just leave you, and then you will not be able to even play a role in the digital economy. So very important for companies to see data protection and accountability as a fundamental building block as part of their strategies to thrive in the digital economy. Okay, so that's the concept of accountability. Now, in terms of the PDPA accountability obligation, what does the PDPA accountability obligation say? Okay, here PDPA defines accountability as a fundamental principle in PDPA, which require organizations to ensure and demonstrate responsibility for PD, which it has collected or obtained for processing, or which it has control over, right? So again, this part about the definition. And for those of you who are interested to look at the Act itself, you will find section 11 and 12 of the Act that will talk about accountability obligation. Okay. Just to give you a very quick snapshot of this, section 11 of the PDPA, it says that organization is responsible for personal data in its possession or under its control, and should designate individual or individuals to be responsible for ensuring compliance. So what section 11 says is that you need to appoint somebody. Okay, typically we refer to this person as a data protection officer, the DPO, who would then be asked or tasked to make sure that the organization complies with the PDPA. Now, section 12 says that organizations should do a few things under this accountability obligation. First, they have to develop and implement the relevant policies and practices to meet this obligation. They have to develop a process to receive a response to complaint. Okay, so now you realize that customers or individuals might come in and complain about the way you handle their personal data, right? So do you have a complaint handling process to handle that, right? So that's something that is expected under this particular section 12. The company is also expected to communicate to its staff all its data protection policies. So there's the element of staff training, education, and communication. Okay, so it's not good enough to have all these policies in place, but as far as the staff is concerned, they are not properly trained, they are not properly informed, and then that's where you miss out a lot of a big gap, the gaping hole in terms of compliance. And they must also make information available on request concerning its data protection policies and practices. Okay, so which means that this calls for companies to be very transparent and upfront about how they handle personal data of their customers and their employees. Okay, so these are the two sections under the PDPA that talks about accountability. Okay, so this is more in terms of graphical representation. When we talk about PDPA, accountability is about what? It's about appointing a DPO. It's about making information available. It's about being responsible for PD under its possession, and it's about demonstrating compliance, right? So this will be the various aspects of the accountability obligations. So let me take this opportunity to maybe share with you one particular case whereby the organization is actually in breach of accountability. Now, if you happen to be following the news, or even you actually go in and check out what PDPC has been investigating and so on, you'll realize that most of the time, in fact, yeah, at least 80% of the time, you will get cases that talks about what companies suffering data breach, right? And when we talk about companies suffering data breach, essentially, as far as PDPA is concerned, it is a failure to protect the data, right? And that's where the company now is in breach of protection obligation, because there's a obligation that is called protection obligation that require the companies to take reasonable effort to protect the data under its care. Okay, now, but however, if you notice and if you happen to be reading some of the cases, you'll realize that sometimes when investigation is ongoing, you'll realize that the companies not just suffer the breach of data protection obligations, you realize that there are some other areas or other obligations that the company might not be compliant with, and one of them could be accountability. Okay, why? Because maybe they did not appoint DPO, or they don't have processes in place, or they don't have proper training and so on. And these are all different aspects of accountability obligation compliance. Okay, so I'll share you one particular company that breached the data accountability. What happened in the case? Which aspects of the accountability, right? And what are the consequences? This is actually a real case, but I actually redacted this the company's name. But it is a case where this is a particular society. So you notice PDPA, if you are aware, it does not just cover companies and businesses. It also covers non-profit organization. It covers societies. It covers social services agency and so on, right? So it covers the whole gamut of organization and entities that is operating in Singapore. So for this particular society, what happened was that PDPC was made aware that this particular company's or this society's data has been hacked and is now available for download, right? And in some hacking forum and also in some Telegram channels, okay? And the information that has been out there in the open, information from their members and non-members who might want to register for a membership, and they include things like name, username, password encrypted, email, mailing address, contact number, gender, date of birth, occupation, quite a lot of things. 5,000 over records were exposed in this forum. Okay, this forum. Okay, and when the companies try and figure out what went wrong, it was because why there was the website was vulnerable and the hackers actually did something to their website by doing some kind of SQL injection. Okay, so this is a bit of what the hacker is doing to put in some programs, and then after that they can then exfiltrate the data. Okay, so that was what happened. Now, and as a result of that, that is indeed a data breach. Okay, and then once the data breach happens, then it means that the company is now in breach of protection. But when the investigation went on, right, what happened was that the accountability obligation is also not being complied with. Why? You will notice they did not appoint a DPO. So some of the learning points from this case is that, hey, they did not appoint a DPO, and then as a result, they are non-compliant to the accountability. Okay, they did not develop the proper personal data protection policy. Okay, their contracts and so on were not tight enough, such that the vendors are not doing the proper website security. So this one has got to do with protection, okay, and so on. And one of the things that they have done is that they have actually done a lot of remedial action, which I share you later. And as a result, there is no other actions needed. So a few things that actually can learn from this case. Okay. So here, the accountability part really will be really the fact that they have not appointed a DPO and they have not put in place any of the policies and processes. Okay. But having encountered the data breach case, what happened was that this society then quickly did a lot of remedial actions. Okay, so they did a lot of things that tried to sort of mitigate the situation. Okay, so they did something to the website. They remove all the members' data from the website. Okay, they change all the login password. They notify the individuals. Okay, they get vendors to develop a new website and appoint a DPO, and they develop and implement their policies. Okay, so as a result of that, the PDPC actually then decide to fine them because of the data breach, but there's no written direction. Written direction here means that there's no additional things that the PDPC wants the companies to act on. Okay, right. So that's actually the particular situation where you realize that as far as the company is concerned, the trigger point is usually data breach. But as you dig into the situation and so on, you realize that there could be other obligations that might come about, and one of them could well be accountability. Okay. Right. So this is about the data protection, PDPA's accountability obligations. Now, I'll share with you the tools and resources that companies can consider to leverage on in order to implement good data protection policies and practices. Okay, so I'll cover these 4 tools. I will share a bit more detail. These are all the acronyms that that I will elaborate a bit more. Okay, so the 4 tools I'm talking about, I'm referring to will be DPMP, DPIA, DP practices for IT systems, and DP Trustmark. Okay, so I'll go through one by one. The first will be the DPMP. So what is DPMP? DPMP stands for Data Protection Management Program. Okay, now for those of you who are interested, you can actually Google this particular document, PDPC in PDPC website. In fact, you can find it, a guide to developing a data protection management program. Okay, and here they have PDPC has already prepared this guide to help the companies to actually go through 4 steps. Okay, in order to develop this program. Okay, governance and risk assessment, policies and practices, processes, and maintenance. Right, so there are 4 steps. Okay, I'll just extract very briefly what you can expect from this this guide, just to give an idea of what it covers. And here we are really looking at the how already, right? Not just knowing what needs to be done, but how to go about doing it. Okay, so when we talk about developing a DPMP, the first step is about governance and risk management, right? So here, the guide will talk about what is it that's needed to set up the proper governance structure. Okay, because you're talking about data, right? Personal data. How do you then how are you going to govern the personal data, and what kind of structure must you put in place to govern the personal data? Okay, and then the other thing to also look at is to understand the risk involved. Of course, in the organization, there are different types of risks, right? You probably have enterprise risk management to take care of different types of risks, but there will be specific data protection related risks that will come about. Okay, for example, third party, right? The third party that are handling your personal data. What kind of risks are we talking about? Okay, you talk about IT, right? There will be IT risks that could well result in perhaps not protecting the data properly. Okay, so there are some of these things that will have to be taken into consideration. Then the next stage is then to set up and define the relevant policies and practices. Okay, so here the guide will talk about what is it that you need to do in order to develop policies and practices for internal parties, internal staff. Okay, for example, your staff and external parties, okay, your third-party vendors and so on, okay, or even your customers. Okay, what are the kind of policies and practices that has to be in place to let the external and internal parties know about what you're doing for personal data? Okay, and here it can also be projects, right? So if you are embarking on a particular project that handles personal data, then what is it that you need to put in place in terms of policies and practices to manage these projects that handle personal data? Okay. Then the next stage is to then look at all the different processes to be put in place, because it's one thing having policies, right? But if you need to operationalize it, then you really have to put in place policy, processes, SOPs, right? Templates, and so on and so forth. Okay, so you have the workflow as well. So this will be the part where where company will have to start defining, first of all, identifying and mapping out what are all the policies and processes that has to be in place, right? How do you manage it? How do you define this so they can better control the processes? And then, of course, at the end of the day, how do you monitor and report? Okay, because you will have to see whether or not your different data protection processes is working or not, and how do you monitor them, and how do you report back to management? Okay, then the last stage, of course, is the maintenance stage, where we are talking about having put all this in place, how do we as an organization then start to review and update the various policies, practices, and processes, right? Because things do change. The law might change, the business might change. Okay, and what does that mean in terms of the impact to your data protection policies, practices, and processes? Okay, so that's something that's important. And of course, at the end of the day, how do we ensure that indeed people do follow? Can we need to then put in place some kind of auditing processes to make sure that on a regular basis or even on ad hoc basis, there are audits that's carried out to make sure that everything that's developed here is done in the proper manner. Okay, so that is something that is the data protection management program. It basically is like running it's like program management, right? But very much focused on data protection initiative. The second one is DPIA. Okay, so DPIA stands for Data Protection Impact Assessment. Okay, now again, you can find more information about this particular guide in PDPC's website. It's called Guide to Data Protection Impact Assessment. Okay, and here within the document, you will get to understand what is DPIA. Okay, when do you conduct DPIA? Who should be involved in DPIA and how to conduct DPIA? Right now, basically, just an idea. The data protection impact assessment compared to DPMP, the difference is that DPMP is very much done at the organization level, right? So as an organization, you have to put in place all these corporate level policies and practices. But when it comes to DPIA, it actually start looking at projects, okay? Because along the way, companies might be embarking on certain projects, right? The salespeople or the customer service side might want to develop a new customer relationship management app, for example, okay, which is going to collect a lot of data. So now, question now is, as you go about looking into the requirements and so on, how do you make sure that you can assess the impact? Is the impact of data protection and breaches and so on going to be very, very high? And what we're going to do in order to mitigate the kind of risk that's involved, right? So on the project level, how do we manage and mitigate the data protection risks involved in implementing this project? That would be an important aspect of the company's view on projects. Okay, now in the guide, it basically provide 6 steps or 6 phases of how to conduct a DPIA. Okay, so in the guide, you will get to see all these different stages of the DPIA phases and how to go about doing it. So there'll be some explanation and some examples as well. Okay, phase 1, assess the need, because not all projects involve personal data, so not all projects require you to go through a DPIA. So those projects that involve PD, then you need to go through the DPIA, and then of course, once you ascertain that you need to conduct a DPIA, then you need to plan for it, and you need to then identify what are all the data and personal data flows, right? How the data will start flowing around within your so-called project and system. Okay, and then of course after that, once you know how data are flowing, then what are the risks involved? Okay, and once you know the risks, then you can actually then create an action plan to mitigate those risks or to even decide not to do something about it, right? Sometimes it could be that the risk is so high that you may decide to then perhaps drop the whole project, right? If the risk is too high. So that will help companies and management to decide how to assess the risk and impact of these projects. Okay, and of course, if you're going to proceed, then how to implement and monitor the action plan. Okay, so this is about the DPIA. Yeah? Now, the third tool that companies can actually make use of is this guide called this resource called DP Practices for ICT Systems. Because you see, if you'll notice that a lot of times we talk about digital transformation and so on, we are always talking about systems, right? IT systems, apps, and so on. The question is, as companies go about, implementing all these IT systems, and especially if they are dealing with personal data, the question that has to be asked is, have we incorporated all the data protection requirements under the PDPA into the system? Because if you have not done that, then there's a very high chance that the system might actually fail the compliance regulatory check later on as you're about to launch a system, because somehow you need to actually then run by your compliance folks, right? And if you do that and you have not incorporated some of these data protection requirements, it might well mean that there has to be a lot of reward just to incorporate all these requirements. Okay, so I give you some examples of what does that mean if you were to look at this from a data protection perspective. Okay, so here we're talking about, okay, so there's also another guide, okay, guide to data protection practices for ICT systems. Okay, so This is where you can get the information from. So the example I'll give you is, for example, when we talk about personal data and so on, first thing is that your system will probably have to be collecting personal data. Okay, so as you collect the personal data, as the system collect the personal data, question from a data protection officer or DP perspective is, are we over collecting the data? Right? Do we need to minimize collection of personal data? Because sometimes if we don't do that, the users will be telling you, I want to collect 20 items. But the question is, do you really need to collect 20 items? Okay, so there's this question about data minimization. Okay, now, if you're collecting personal data and it involves collection of personal identifiers such as NRIC, for example, then you know that there are certain requirements around NRIC, right? How you collect NRIC and all the national identifier. Then, of course, the question is, do we absolutely collect NRIC, or can we even collect partial IC, for example? Okay, so things like that. And so there'll be all these kind of questions that has to be asked from a data protection perspective with regard to ICT systems, right? So these are some of the DP practices. Retention of personal data. Okay, now at some point, personal data will not be used anymore, and if there's no reason to keep the personal data, then you have to then discard it, right, or not retain it. Okay, so question is, what happened to all the data that we don't need anymore? Do we have a retention policy? Do we keep this for 1-2 years, or do we not keep it all, right? And if we don't keep it, do I want to anonymize the records? Okay, and how do I go about disposing it properly? Because if you don't dispose it properly, right, it might end up to be exposed by someone, and then it gets out into some of the forum and so on, and that's it. That becomes a data breach, just like the society's case. Okay, so if you think about it, there are actually very different. There are different stages of the ICT development life cycle where you will require us to start thinking about what are the data protection practices that has to be incorporated into the data protection, into the IT systems or apps. Okay, so that will be more in terms of the DP practices for ICT. The last one will be the DPTM. Okay, DPTM is DP Trust Mark. Okay, data protection trust mark. This is something which you might be hearing quite often nowadays. It is similar to, I'm not sure whether you're familiar last time, when you talk about consumers, right, there's this thing called case trust, whereby when you go in, like in shops, you see a case trust logo, you will know that, oh, okay, this shop is actually quite trustworthy because consumer case has already sort of certified them. Likewise, companies can apply to have their company to be certified as DP Trust Mark certified. Okay, similar to case trust, and also similar to some of you all might be familiar with your ISO 9000 kind of effort, whereby you actually put in place all your policies and processes, and then you get somebody, assessors to come in to assess whether or not all the things they've done is in accordance with the ISO 9000, for example, right? So in this case, the DP Trust Mark will allow companies to put their companies to be assessed by independent assessors, and then if they are able to meet certain requirements, then they'll be issued a DP Trust Mark. Okay, and once you are issued that, then it actually in a way demonstrate that you have already got all the necessary policies and practices in place. Right, so it's a very, very strong example of what accountability is. Okay, now for those interested to get trust mark, not that easy. You have to actually follow or make sure that you have all these 4 principles that is being defined in the trust mark. Because why? The assessors will be using all these criteria to assess whether or not your company is able to meet all these requirements. Okay, as I said, very similar to ISO 9000 or SQC or that kind of certification process. Okay, and of course, for companies that have obtained DP Trust Mark, then the benefits of DP Trust Mark is that it should in fact increase business competitiveness, right? Because between a company that has got DP Trust Mark, let's say I'm looking at a travel agent, for example, I want to go for a trip. Okay, and then I go to the shop. I go to the shopping mall. I have seen two different travel agent. One of them has got a DB Trustmark. The other one don't have. Right. Then as a consumer, you might decide, maybe I should go with the travel agent that has got DB Trustmark, because why? I know that they have all these proper policies and practices in place, right? So things like that might help to differentiate a company from another. Okay, and it's also a way for you to tell your customers that, look, uh, giving the customer the assurance that your company is doing all these things properly. Okay, so it's all about responsible use of personal data as well. All right. Okay, so that will be essentially the benefits of Transmart, and I've shared you 4 different tools and resources that you can tap on to help you in terms of trying to address the accountability requirements of the PDPA. Okay, what next? Here, they see, the thing is that this webinar is just to give you a very, very high level overview. Now, my company, together with ACE NUS, we have actually we're going to run a 3-day training program that's actually going to address quite a lot of these areas in terms of accountability and more. So if you are interested and so on, you could in fact email to this SOC ACE email address to find out more about this particular course. Okay, what I'll do is I'll just give you a very quick overview of what this course is about. Okay, so the course here, we will be using the course, a 3-day course, to touch on the what, right? What is PDPA? Okay, what are the 11 obligations? What is the DNC obligation? What are the various enforcement considerations, the things that we didn't know of, and the impact of PDPA on some topics like employment, right? Handling children's data, photography, and so on and so forth. Okay, and then after that, the next step will be how, right? So this course will cover the how, in terms of what to do in terms of doing current state assessment, okay, the tools that are involved, and then once you identify the gaps, what can you do in terms of policies, processes, and people to address all your gaps, and then how you can then put everything together under the DPMP, which I mentioned about, and then if there are projects that require having a PD, then how do we then make use of the DPIA, okay, to then address the impact and the risk of your projects. Okay,